Dear friends, the 1971 winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, Simon Kuznets, stated that, based on their economic performance, there were 4 kinds of countries: developed countries, developing countries, Argentina, and Japan. Folks, both Argentina and Japan are currently facing many economic problems, but the steps taken to reach their present situations, they couldn't have been more different. Their paths have been so different that we want to take a closer look. So what steps have Argentina and Japan followed to get to where they are today? How are they similar? How are they different? How did Japan, a rocky island without natural resources, manage to progress while Argentina, with its vast territory and a huge amount of resources, struggles to keep its state out of chronic crisis? Well, we're going to tell you all about it in today's video.
Opposite paths.
Are some countries doomed to success and others to failure? Are natural resources a blessing or a punishment? Well, let's go back to the first half of the 20th century. How was Argentina's economy compared to Japan's 100 years ago? Folks, in the early 1900s, the differences between Argentina and Japan were extreme. Their situations were the opposite of what they are today. Argentina was a much more developed country than Japan. It had natural resources, an educated population, and open trade with the rest of the world. It was a world power. It was a country that was wealthier than the United States. Meanwhile, Japan was a much less developed country that had very traditional institutions. If we had been asked for a forecast at that time, we would have probably all picked Argentina to go on and become the richest country on the planet, while Japan would struggle for subsistence. Perhaps what differentiated these two countries the most was their natural resources. While the Argentine territory is full of natural resources, Mother Nature was not so generous with the Japanese. Japan is a small chain of rocky islands with very little habitable territory. It's exposed to all kinds of natural disasters, and it has very few natural resources. As if that weren't enough, in 1945, World War II ended with the detonation of 2 nuclear bombs over Japan, the only ones that have ever been used in war. From that moment on, the country was devastated. Cities, infrastructure, and industry were to a large extent destroyed. Over 3 million Japanese, especially young Japanese, lost their lives, and more than 10 million soldiers returned home from the front with no jobs. In 1945, nobody, absolutely nobody, would have bet on Japan's future. But practically all of us would have bet on Argentina's future. You see, at the beginning of the 20th century, Argentina was also something of a beacon in Latin America. Its economy was among the top 10 in the world, it had the highest social development levels, its rail network was growing rapidly, the education system was highly advanced, and the country held a large share in the global capital market. Want some examples? Well, in those years, Argentina was one of the main recipients of direct European investment. It was one of the largest primary goods exporters in the world and the second most popular destination for immigrants from the old continent. Yes, at this time, Germans, Spaniards, and Italians migrated en masse to Argentina. In other words, we're talking about a country that saw the United States as its equal. That explains why, at the time, Buenos Aires was on the list with London, New York, or any other major city in the world. And on top of that, it managed to stay out of the Second World War, saving many lives and many dollars. So don't tell me you wouldn't have bet on Argentina. I bet my last cent you would. But hold on just a second, because things soon began to change. Take a look at this chart. At the beginning of the 20th century, Argentina's GDP per capita was 3 times higher than that of Japan. This gap remained until the end of the Second World War. However, from the 50s onwards, there was a significant change. Suddenly, Japan began catching up at full speed, so much so that by the end of the 1960s, the land of the rising sun had already surpassed Argentina. Since then, the gap has only increased. So the question is, what happened? What did Japan do that Argentina didn't? Well, listen up.
Japan versus Argentina.
Argentina's territory is 7 times larger than that of Japan, while Argentina's population is only about 1/3 of Japan's. But density isn't the only difference between the two countries. As we've already mentioned, the Argentine territory, when compared to Japan, is much more fertile and also boasts a lot of natural resources of all kinds. Oil, natural gas, gold, silver, copper, coal, iron, lithium. Argentina still has practically everything.
Argentina is ranked 6th on the list of countries with the largest amount of mining resources in the world.
Of course, being blessed with natural conditions doesn't make production any simpler. During the 19th century, Argentinian investors poured a lot of money into machinery and infrastructure so that the country could become one of the largest food producers in the world by the beginning of the 20th century. In the 1800s, Argentina's political system and institutions such as property rights or freedom of trade encouraged investors to invest their money in the country. Meanwhile, during the second half of the 19th century, Japan made similar changes. We've already talked about this on VisualPolitik, and I'm going to leave a link to that video in the description below. This was known as the Meiji Restoration. However, as changes were slower and the natural conditions harder, the result by the beginning of the 20th century was not so impressive. And then, well, along came the Second World War. The end of this conflict left Japan a ruined, broken, and devastated country, while Argentina, which, although it had suffered during the crisis of 1929, was still a prosperous country. It was even a creditor for England and many other nations that had participated in the war. So, with a solid financial position, many natural resources, a well-educated population, no threat of war or conflicts, a growing middle class, and a huge global demand for food, the prospects for the country of tango couldn't have really been better. But let's go back to the main question. At what point did Argentina and Japan begin to take such different and divergent paths? You see, after the Second World War, Japan, in one way or another, began to slowly assimilate and copy many of the elements that had made the United States prosper. This had a lot to do with the US occupation under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, leader of the Supreme Command of the Allied Forces. These occupation forces aimed to demilitarize and democratize Japanese society. To do so, the Constitution was rewritten and many of the US's institutions were copied, such as the limitation of the power and of the government's size, the protection of private property, and the freedom of business and commerce. In short, Japan opened itself up to the world. Meanwhile, Argentina did the opposite. In February 1946, Juan Domingo Perón became the country's president. With him came a real model change for the South American country. Suddenly, the state began to increase its size and its influence on the economy and all aspects of Argentinian society. A lot of countries were nationalized, especially those dedicated to transport, energy, and communications, under the government's control, and a lot of restrictions on foreign trade were approved. In addition, there were a lot of regulations of all kinds. In practice, Perón transformed Argentina into a kind of army ruled by the orders of its president. To carry out his plans, the liberal constitution of 1853 was replaced by a Peronist one in 1949. In the first 10 years of Perón's leadership, the government distortions of the state's economic activity were so great that Argentinians eventually had to eat black bread and ration their meat consumption. This was not because of a vegan fad or anything like that, but because of scarcity. Argentinian producers opted to stop producing rather than comply with the price controls or the exchange rates that were established by the government. And on top of all of that, Perón's exit from power didn't really cause any change. Yes, some economic freedoms were reintroduced and some controls were suppressed, but the state's weight, its size, and its interference in the country's economic activity did not recede. Public spending, high taxes, and inflation had come to stay. folks, the changes Perón set in motion in Argentina became definitive. And to this we must add the political instability caused by a succession of military coups. These are a crisis that happens in Argentina over and over again every 5 to 10 years. The result, as you all know, is that today Argentina is no longer one of the 10 richest countries in the world. It's not even in the top 25. It's not even in the top 50. According to data from the International Monetary Fund and taking price differences into account, in purchasing power parity terms, Argentina ranks 62nd in the countries with the highest GDP per capita. That is, it's at the same level as countries like Iran, Belarus, or Gabon. And everything indicates that after the last crisis, it's going to fall even further down the list. Today, 32% of Argentinians, that's 1 in 3, live in poverty. Argentina is one of the few countries in the world where poverty is increasing instead of decreasing. Anyway folks, that's how Japan and Argentina evolved. In several videos on this channel, we've seen in detail how Argentina and Japan became what they are today. But now the question is, can we extract some key points from comparing these two? Well, I believe we can. Check this out.
The key points.
Let's see. By comparing Argentina and Japan, we can extract 3 main ideas that I think we should always take into account. The first, and let's make this really clear, is that a country isn't rich or poor because of its natural resources or its size. It's useless to have huge amounts of resources if they aren't properly exploited. In fact, Japan proves that a country can be very rich without having natural resources or a lot of territory. What matters, folks, what really makes a difference in wealth generation is a country's level of capital, investment, and work. Innovation and productivity are much more important than natural resources. The second idea is that a country that reaches a high level of development and prosperity is not guaranteed to sustain that level indefinitely. Wealth doesn't exist per se. It has to be created continually, and its creation needs to adapt to the changes that occur in the world. Otherwise, you could have a similar experience to Argentina, which went from being the richest country on Earth to 62nd place and falling. Of course, such a decline in fortune is bad for everyone, especially for the most disadvantaged members of the population. Punishing a productive economy is always a bad idea. The third idea is that wealth isn't achieved by government spending like crazy. Public spending can only be financed through 3 methods: more taxes, more public debt, or running the bill printing machine, that is, increasing inflation. All 3 methods cause nothing but crisis and poverty. You have to be very clear about where public spending will end if you want a country to prosper. And if you don't believe me, you can see another good example of this in Venezuela. Anyway folks, this was a comparison comparing how Argentina and Japan evolved and what we can learn from them. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.